In a conversation this week, I was explaining to the person why I don't consider myself a biblical literalist. And today's story is at least one of the reasons that I don't take the entire Bible to be literally true. If I were to take the two different creation stories to be literally true, then I'd also have to believe that there were two creations. The first one in Genesis 1, taking, as you know, 6 days, where humans, male and female, are created after all of the other animals. The second creation story has no firm timeline, like 6 days. And the first human male is created before all the other animals. And the first human female is created after all the other animals. Taking every part of the Bible as literal truth often causes us to miss the deeper meanings of the stories. For instance, and some of you have heard me talk about this, instead of getting hung up on Jonah somehow getting swallowed by a whale, if we look more deeply into that story and the humor in that story, we find that it's actually a very powerful tale about prejudice. There's sometimes dark humor in that story. It includes the part towards the end where Jonah is more distraught because a bush is withering, a bush that he was using for shade. He's more distressed that it is dying than he is about the potential destruction of more than 120,000 people living in the city of Nineveh, people he didn't like. So what's the deeper story here, in the story of Adam and Eve? Well, first of all, as you could tell by the title of the sermon this morning, Eve was framed. The innocence of the garden was never designed to last forever. Just like the innocence of every human child. Every child passes from innocence into the greater complexity of the human existence, right? So at a deeper level, Eve is really the hero of the story because she has the courage to attain the knowledge of the difference between good and evil. That's going to be my main point. But before we venture down that road any further, I want to take a look at another truth in the story. We humans are really good at making excuses for the things that we have done. When they are caught by God, Adam says, and I'm paraphrasing, which will probably be obvious, when caught by God, Adam says, hey, wait a minute. I really didn't do anything wrong, and in a way, it's really your fault, God. Because it was the woman whom you gave to be with me. It was her fault. And if you hadn't made her, none of this would have happened. So, God, don't you feel bad about what you've done here? And then when God turns to Eve and asks what happened, she immediately turns on the serpent. Well, you see, God, there was this serpent. And by golly, no one can blame me because that darned wily snake tricked me. And that's why I ate. I wonder how many excuses we have formulated over the course of our lifetimes. The traffic was horrible this morning. That's why I'm late. True meaning, there was horrible traffic through the drive-thru at Starbucks. In his wonderful book, Teacher Man, Frank McCourt, the Irish author of several wonderful memoirs, including my favorite, Angela's Ashes, he tells of his experience teaching in English in a kind of rough and tumble public high school in Staten Island. After he'd been at the school for a time, he began to collect the notes that he received from students excusing their absence or their inability to complete a particular assignment. Those notes were supposedly from a parent, but they were all clearly forged. There's nothing particularly noteworthy in that. What interested McCourt, however, and why he saved these excuse notes, is how wonderfully they were written. Far superior to any other writing his students would do in class. And he writes, if their parents could read those notes, they'd discover their kids capable of the finest American prose, fluent, imaginative, clear, dramatic, fantastic, focused, persuasive, useful. And here are some of the excuses that he collected. The stove caught fire and the wallpaper went up, and the fire department kept us out of the house all night. Another. Arnold doesn't have his work today because he was getting off the train yesterday and the door closed on his school bag and the train took it away. He yelled to the conductor, who said some very vulgar things as the train drove away. Something should be done. A man died in the bathtub upstairs and it overflowed and messed up Roberta's homework on the table. And this one, this is too good. Her big brother got mad at her and threw her essay out the window, and it flew all over Staten Island, which is not a good thing because people will read it and get the wrong impression unless they read the excellent ending, which explains everything. We were evicted from our apartment, and the mean sheriff said if my son kept yelling for his notebook, he'd have us all arrested. There you go. McCourt reflects, isn't it remarkable, I thought, how they resist any kind of writing assignment in class or at home. They whine and they say they're too busy or it's too hard putting 200 words together on any subject. I have to ask why. I have a drawer full of excuse notes that could be turned into an anthology of great American excuses. So one day he gave his students an assignment. He wrote it on the board. An excuse note from Adam to God, or an excuse note from Eve to God. And he told his students they could start writing their essays in class and finish them at home. He writes, their heads went down, pens raced across paper. They could do this with one hand tied behind their backs. The bell rang, and for the first time in all of my years of teaching, I saw high school students so immersed that they had to be urged out of the room by friends who were hungry for lunch. As you can imagine, it prompted the most imaginative and expressive writing he had seen. I wonder how many excuses Frank McCourt heard during his tenure at that school. He said he had a desk drawer full of excuse notes. Brenda, did you ever do anything like that? I have to wonder how big the drawer was. And if that drawer was big, I wonder how big the drawer that God must have to hold all of our excuses. Now back to that larger question of human development, because human development is at the heart of this story. The garden in the story was never supposed to be a permanent dwelling place. That's why there was a tree containing a mysterious fruit that would open the eyes of those who ate it. Each of us gets our eyes opened to the greater truths of morality in different ways, at different ages, but it happens. Why would God even put such a tree in the garden if it was going to create a tragedy? Now, similar questions have gotten many precocious children in trouble over the years in Sunday school. Little Johnny asked, how can God justify punishing Adam and Eve for eating the tree of the knowledge of good and evil when prior to eating from the tree, they didn't have any knowledge of good and evil. And did God lie when God said, "But of the tree of knowledge you shall not eat, for in that day you will die"? Even according to canonical Bibles, the serpent was right. The serpent was right on that count, because the serpent hissed into Eve's ear, "You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be a little like God, knowing good and evil." As children, and sometimes even as adults, we are often told that the story of Adam and Eve is a story about the fall from the original perfect state of grace that is now forever messed up and lost to the past. But in another ancient text that wasn't included in the Bible, called the Testimony of Truth, a greater truth saw that the snake was hissing at all of us too, warning us not to long for some allegedly perfect past that we now see never existed and was merely the limited knowledge of childhood innocence, and encouraging us to transgress the false limitations of childhood and move toward the future, toward growing up, toward being religious in a way that welcomes and integrates adult knowledge and adult sexuality as normal, natural, and healthy parts of life. We were never supposed to remain in a state of perfect innocence. We are supposed to ask the difficult questions. We are supposed to grapple with complex moral issues. So, thank God for Eve, our hero. She realized the limits of the garden and pushed beyond its boundaries to real life. Life as we know it, messy, wonderful, perplexing, beautiful. And truth be told, we wouldn't want it any other way. Amen.